Let's say um, you are cooking with your honey and you're planning to have a nice evening, but your honey does something that really makes you feel uh, disrespected or humiliated. You may automatically activate an action pattern that comes from how you dealt with your older brother when he was torturing you as a kid. And you start treating your honey as if he were your older brother when you're 3 years old. And your honey will go, wow, what got into you? Or more likely, your honey will activate a different fixed action pattern of how your honey dealt with somebody upsetting him as a kid. And before too long, you're beating each other up, just like you did as a 3-year-old. Um, that is the nature of the beast. That's who we are.
Marriage, intimate relationships, domestic partnerships always involve triggering. Because again, it's that traumatic attachment idea. As soon as we get close, we are vulnerable to being triggered. Because if our feelings have been hurt, if we've been traumatized, if we've been neglected, if we've had parents who were cold and distant, if we had parents who were very loving but very volatile, whatever our childhood experience, we have hurt places. Even the healthiest of us have hurt places that are going to get triggered by our significant others.
That was Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Janina Fisher. And they've just given us a glimpse into how trauma and its effects can get so deeply embedded within relationships. And here's the thing. Many patients can feel trauma's after effects in all their relationships, from the casual ones all the way to the most intimate. That's why we're devoting this entire session to looking at how we can help patients whose past trauma triggers problems in their current relationships. Hi, I'm Dr. Ruth Basinski, a licensed psychologist in the state of Connecticut and the president of the National Institute for the Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. And thank you for joining us for this fifth and final session of the Advanced Master Program on the Treatment of Trauma. We've had so far more than 42,000 practitioners from 134 countries show up to join us over the course of this program. And whether this is your first time joining us, or maybe you've been with us for every session, I'm so glad that you're here. Now, I just want to start with a message to the people watching who aren't practitioners. This is a program made for practitioners, people who've studied for years and have advanced degrees, and for the most part have licenses to practice. But I know a small percentage of our audience is made up of lay people, people who don't practice in the field. First of all, I want to tell you, you are welcome here. But the second point, and this is really important, the second point that I want you to hear is that trauma is not a life sentence. In my descriptions of the trauma experience, I've been careful throughout to say that certain things can happen. That doesn't mean they will. And even if they do, that doesn't mean that you can't heal and grow from the experience. So while it's certainly true that trauma can be devastating, it doesn't have to be the way you define the rest of your life. So let's go on. Coming up in this session, we'll review the profound impact trauma experience can have on someone's ability to engage with others. We'll take a look at two specific kinds of trauma. And as you'll see, one kind can be so insidious that your patient may not even be aware that they've experienced it, or they may not understand how easily they can get triggered by it. We'll also look at a way of thinking about the psyche that can help patients understand the after effects of trauma. This is important because this understanding can also help them engage in relationships from their most meaningful, thoughtful, mature self. Not only that, We'll get into how to recognize and address the more subtle signs of trauma that stem from male sexual abuse. And then we'll examine the critical role your therapeutic relationship can play in transforming your patient's ability to connect with others in more healthy, functional ways. We'll also give you specific strategies that you can use with couples when trauma lies at the heart of their relationship dynamics. Specifically, we'll get into how you can help couples understand the implicit memories that fuel conflict in their relationships. And we'll look at how trauma can cause patients to reenact past relationships, as well as how you can help them break that cycle. And then finally, we'll look at the specific trauma responses and adaptations that we've covered over the last 4 weeks. So that's the freeze response, dissociation, collapse, submit, please and appease, shut down, and shame. We'll look at how each of those can impact your patient's relationship and how you might work with them. So let's jump in. Now, in order to fully grasp trauma's profound effect on relationships, let's review exactly how trauma impacts our social engagement system. We've talked about this throughout the program, but it's the part of our nervous system that enables us to communicate, connect, attach, and even play with others. When we're within our window of tolerance, our social engagement system is online, and we can think and feel simultaneously and adapt to whatever situation we might be facing. But when we sense danger or experience trauma, we leave our window of tolerance. And here's what can happen to our social engagement system.
We see it going dormant. We see it just being stripped off, taken out of the toolkit of the individual, because the bodies of the individuals who have survived trauma have to now be coping with threat, chronic threat. If they don't have the social engagement system, the autonomic nervous system, and our overall nervous system goes into defense. The first primary defense is we use our physical strength. We fight or flee. And that makes us combative. It doesn't make us lovers.
What Dr. Stephen Porges just described is the primitive response we've all inherited from our ancestors. When a threat situation kicks the autonomic nervous system into gear, it shuts down a person's social engagement system and directs all physiological resources towards survival responses, the fight, flight, freeze, collapse, submit, or attach cry for help. What's more, when our social engagement system is shut down, we can miss or misinterpret interpersonal cues. And so what happens is we often mistake other people's words and actions as threatening. So let's look at two specific kinds of trauma that can take patients out of their window of tolerance and knock the social engagement system offline.
The trauma that we normally think of is intrusive and disempowering, right? So you're shamed, you're yelled at, your bones are broken, control is exerted, there's rage or sexual intrusion. But intrusive trauma is only one form of trauma. The other form of relational trauma is neglect. And a lot of people who come in and go, oh yeah, I came from a perfect family, I have no trauma. Once you start to lay this out, they can begin to see things a little differently. So one cut is the trauma intrusive, or is it negligent? Is it a violation, or is it an abandonment?
What you've just heard from Terry Reel is key to identifying potential trauma-related issues that may be affecting your patient's relationships. We need to be on the lookout for not only signs of violent, intrusive trauma, but also the more subtle attachment trauma of neglect and abandonment. So when you're working with a patient who presents with relationship issues, how might you assess for those more subtle attachment traumas?
I say that there are three aspects of good parenting: limits, guidance, and nurture. So I would ask this person, limits, guidance, and nurture in the 5 domains of human experience, in no particular order: physical, sexual, intellectual, emotional, spiritual.
Were you nurtured intellectually? Did you all sit around at the dinner table and talk about ideas? Was somebody looking after your homework? That's usually the easy one. People usually say yes to that. Were you physically nurtured? Well, there was food on the table. I was fed. I was clothed. Well, how often were you hugged? How often did you cuddle? How often were you told, I love you? No, no, no. Okay, that's neglect. Listen, more children are taken from their homes because of neglect than because of violent abuse.
So while trauma that's intrusive and violating can often be easy to pinpoint, trauma that originates from neglect or abandonment can be especially insidious because it might not be as obvious to either the patient or even to the practitioner. As patients begin to understand this, it can give them a sense of just how deeply their past relationships impact their present relationships. It can help them begin to see how a spouse or partner can become confused or even hurt by a response that's triggered from past trauma. What's more, when someone is triggered by a past experience, they're not able to stay in the present in their relationships. And it's often that inability to stay in the present that can set off a new cycle of relational distress.
You know, we talk a lot about being present to one another, and when I hear that word, I always think about it in terms of tense. Are you actually in the present with your partner? You know, one of the things I say is there's no such thing as overreacting. There isn't. It's just that what the person is reacting to may not be in the present, may not be what's in front of them. So we get triggered. We all become our mothers and fathers. We all people our marriages with our mothers and fathers. One of my patients said he was in a fight with his partner. It was a gay couple. And he looked at his partner and said, I think I just fathered all over you. I think I just projected my father all over you. Good for him.
So that's a helpful snapshot of how past relationships keep getting replayed in the present. Now, I want to get into a way of thinking about the psyche. This will divide it into 3 parts because this can help patients understand the after effects of trauma. These ideas come from Terry Reel's relational life therapy model. First, we have the wounded inner child. This part could be pre-verbal, it's sensitive, and also it's vulnerable.
It's usually seen as first moments of birth all the way into 4 or 5 or 6. And that wounded child part of us is the part of us that was just on the receiving end of the abuse or neglect. And that part of us usually just feels overwhelmed. You know, the wounded child part of most people just wants to crawl up in somebody's lap and cry for about 100 years. And that's the traumatized part of us that I think most trauma work focuses on. Very early, very young, on the receiving end of the trauma.
Next, we have the adaptive child. The adaptive child develops in response to abuse or harm in order to protect the wounded child.
The adaptive child part of us is a kid's version of a grown-up. It's the grown-up that you cobble together in the face of your abuse or neglect. And it's a child's version of what a grown-up is supposed to look like. So it's black and white. It tends to be harsh. It tends to be rigid. It tends to be perfectionistic and unforgiving. It's reaction to the aggressor and it's identification with the aggressor, both at the same time. I will be the perpetrator who hurt me. I will become that person and be safe that way. Or I have the entitlement to behave like that because doesn't everybody? Isn't that normal? It's what I grew up with.
And finally, there's the functional adult.
The present-based you that can be thoughtful, that can stop and pause, that can make deliberate decisions to go through door B this time instead of the usual door A.
So the functional adult is what we want to help patients activate because it's the part that manages emotions. And just to link this to some of the ideas you've heard throughout this program, the functional adult is akin to the patient being within their window of tolerance and being regulated enough to think and feel simultaneously. So now that we've gotten a sense of all three of the psyches in Terry's model, I want to zero in on the adaptive child in particular, because here's the thing.
It's not the wounded child part of us that messes up our relationships. It's the adaptive child part of us that messes up our relationships. And we have to deal with that part for one simple reason. The adaptive child part of us will never use skills. You can teach it skills till you're blue in the face. The adaptive child part of us isn't interested in intimacy to begin with. It's interested in self-preservation. The adaptive child part of us will experience intimacy as threatening, actually, as an invitation to vulnerability that it doesn't want.
Now, that idea is so important to get a hold of when you're working with patients who have experienced trauma. That is, it's the adaptive child, what Terry Real described as a kid's version of a grown-up. That adaptive child creates problems in their adult relationships.
The first order of business is bringing somebody into that functional adult part of them so that I can have a reasonable conversation with them. And then to begin to extract that adaptive child part of them, you separate that older child part of us from the present adult part of us so that you can look at it at arm's length and begin to dialogue with it. And in the deep trauma work that I do, I actually have people identify that child, the age of that child. I can talk about how to do that. Put it into an empty chair and begin to interact with it, to talk with it. There are three questions that get me into the trauma work. Who did you see do this? Or who did it to you? Or, and this is an interesting one, who did you do it to and no one stopped you?
Terry's questions suggest three mutually exclusive conditions: that the patient may have been a witness, a victim, or someone who acted badly themselves because no one stopped them. But how does this play out as a person matures into adulthood? And how do you work with the adaptive child who has emerged?
I did work with a grandiose woman with her 15-year-old adaptive child who was a rager. And this woman had suffered all kinds of terrible sex abuse. And that rager was her attempt to, to have some power, to have some strength, to preserve some kind of autonomy. She became that rebellious 15-year-old. She just hated the world and acted out with everybody and everything in rage. She hated that little part of her. And in the work that we did together, she came to replace hating that part with her with being compassionate to that part of her. And she broke down and sobbed like a baby and told that 15-year-old, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. And I'm feeding her lines. It wasn't your fault. I want you to know that I'm here now. I want you to know I can take care of you. I want you to know that you never have to be alone again. And I feed her. You cannot rage at Harry. You cannot go after my husband. Those days are over. So what you want to do with your adaptive child is love them, teach them, and limit them. They will make a mess of your personal relationships if you let them run them up.
Now let's look at Dr. Richard Schwartz's parts-based work. As I know you know, Richard is the founder of Internal Family Systems, and his work on helping clients heal their wounded parts has been groundbreaking in the treatment of trauma. Because here's the thing, we all have parts, and there can be many that are hidden, unknown, or unrecognized, and out of our conscious control. But each part is unique and has a specific critical role to play in our lives. The problem is,
we all wind up with a bunch of what I'm going to call exiled parts. And after that happens, the world seems a lot more dangerous. And you feel a lot more delicate because there are lots of things, relationships in particular, that can trigger those exiles. And when they get triggered, it's like an explosion of flames of emotion that threaten to totally consume you. And so to keep that from happening, other parts are forced into extreme protector roles. And they protect by trying to control everything in your environment. And that would include your relationship. As a trauma survivor, you come out with a bunch of almost like invisible bone bruises. And you don't even know that they're there because they're invisible, but your partner has a way of poking them. So when that gets poked, then something's got to be done about the explosion of exiled emotion immediately. And so there's another set of parts who go into action to get you out of that immediately, and can be very impulsive and reactive and don't care about the collateral damage to your relationship or to your body or to anything else. They just think, I've got to get you out of this terror, or I've got to get you out of this pain right now, no matter what it takes.
I appreciate how Dick, just like in trauma, to invisible bone bruises, especially because some types of relational trauma can be especially difficult to pick up on. In particular, I'm thinking about how this can happen with men who've had sexual experiences far too early. According to Dr. Tamar Bryant Davis, male sexual abuse often manifests in ways that aren't talked about or explored.
Many, when I work with them, had not framed it to themselves as having been molested, right? So it's also why it's important how we ask the question. Right? 'Cause if we just ask a man, were you sexually abused or molested as a child? No, right? Like, absolutely not. And it's not even like they are thinking they were and they don't want you to know. They really are honestly like, no.
Now, this is a crucial point. A lot of men have experienced some kind of sexual abuse, but they didn't call it that. That's because they may not have recognized or even experienced it as abuse. You see, many times, men don't recognize that they were abused because they might have interpreted their experience in a way that doesn't acknowledge the fear, confusion, embarrassment, and shame that was underneath.
Because often these situations where it's a boy who is sexually abused by a woman or a girl, it gets presented as a success story or a triumph, or, oh my goodness, like, you had it going on and you were only 8 years old, right? And so there was this power dynamic that wasn't acknowledged, and they had to emotionally disconnect. Not only that, often boys have been socialized to be emotionally disconnected from their bodies, right? It's not about how, like, do you really like this girl, right? It is more about, get as many people as you can, and like that becomes a badge of honor.
I want to underscore just how damaging this kind of experience can be, even when a man initially embraces the cultural message that it's a triumph. And because of how men are often socialized with regard to sex and sexuality, it can be hard for them to recognize sexual experience as abuse or as harmful, or as anything that might factor into their current relationship problems, their problems in the present.
So then the way it has come out more so is when I say, tell me about your first sexual experience, right? And then as they describe it, then, that's where you're hearing it. And so it becomes this sudden awareness of like, that was what that babysitter did to you. It wasn't just because, like, oh, you were like a handsome 9-year-old, right? Like, for us to really make sense of that.
Now, before we go on, I want you to key in on two significant elements that are factoring in here. First, there's the element of power. And second, there's the one potentially tricky nuance. You see, when we talk about child sexual abuse and the perpetrator as an authority figure or someone in a position of power, we're usually referring to a teacher or a priest, a grandfather or an uncle, someone who's an adult. But what's so insidious about male sexual abuse in particular is that the abuse may have happened at the hands of another child. Maybe it was a babysitter or someone the boy played sports with, for instance. Or, in other words, it's someone your patient could almost think of as a peer, but not quite. Someone who was just a bit more experienced and whom your patient might have even looked up to. This is just one more thing that can complicate your patient's ability to process or even talk about what happened.
Usually the script would be around like, oh, like a big one is the laughing. They're telling the story, and if you highlight the age or the people or the roles, then there can be like this nervous laughter, but not really acknowledging, like, what was that really like in the moment? And for a lot, fear, and confusion and embarrassment. And because they received the script, there also could be some pride in it of like, does this must mean like I'm special, right? Or like I'm a man.
Tama just raised something so important. When a client has experienced shame and embarrassment as a result of trauma, they might choose to deflect or use humor to skirt the issue. But here's the thing. It's critical that you don't mistake your patient's minimization to mean that the experience wasn't traumatic. In fact, it could be a sign that it was traumatic, but your patient hasn't been able to admit it even to themselves, especially when our culture idealizes it. So when you start to notice that your patient might be deflecting or minimizing their pain with humor, how can you gently guide them to connect to it instead?
When it happens in my session, I usually draw awareness to it. And I may say, I just noticed that we were talking about something very painful, but at the same time you smiled or you laughed. Can you tell me a bit about that? And often people aren't aware at all. And, just bringing it up draws their awareness to it. And then frequently, they will say, yeah, I must do that because it's too painful. And usually then, what I love to talk about with people is how traumatized individuals often wear a mask, right? They smile, they pretend everything is okay, they're dressed very well, and nobody can see their pain. And so, then we begin the conversation about, what do you need to feel safe enough to slowly bring down that mask at a pace that feels comfortable for you? Because it's so important to be able to tell your truth when you're traumatized. And so we begin this really, paced, slow, respectful process. And that, of course, requires feedback from the client, ongoing feedback. What's this like, when the mask comes down a little bit? Is this too quick? Is it too slow? And so to really engage in that dialogue and in the relationship, to slowly remove the mask and move towards speaking your own truth.
Now, this strategy Dr. Ruth Laney has just shared is part of the Critical Insight session. That's one of our 4 special learning tools that are included in the Gold package. In fact, we've developed a full set of learning tools to go with each session in the program. They're designed specifically with application in mind to help you break down the ideas and concepts from each module into practical strategies that you can use with your patients. So if you haven't yet registered for the Gold package, please do so if you can. Your purchase allows us to keep developing programs like these because it helps to support all the members of the NICABM staff who've poured thousands of hours into the researching, writing, editing, video producing, graphic design, and technical support elements that make these programs possible. Just use the link below at any time during or after the broadcast to purchase the Gold package. So now let's go back to Tama for a look at another pattern that she sees when she works with male sexual abuse survivors: serial infidelity.
Some men then later in life have real difficulty actually with intimacy with someone who knows them. I mean, emotionally knows them. That can feel very vulnerable. It can feel very threatening. It can feel very it can feel unsatisfying because there is a sense of being exposed. If you are with different people, you retain a sense of power because they don't really know you. There is more this sense of like a conquest, or I'm in charge, and all this person sees about me is what I am showing them in the moment, versus in a relationship.
So far, we've looked at a way of thinking about three parts of the psyche that can help patients understand the after effects of trauma. We also got into how to recognize and address the more subtle signs of trauma that stem from male sexual abuse. So now let's get into the critical role your therapeutic relationship can play in transforming your patient's ability to connect with others in more healthy, functional ways. You see, when relational trauma is part of your patient's history, your role becomes especially crucial. That's because your patient's ability to manage the common ups and downs of relationships and to repair the normal ruptures that occur in any relationship, particularly the closest ones, their ability to do that is impaired by trauma. So, working out normal relationship challenges like conflicts, unfulfilled expectations, and misunderstandings within the therapeutic relationship can transform your patient's life. But where do we begin? Well, a good place to start is with the social engagement system. Earlier in this session, Dr. Stephen Porges described how trauma knocks a person's social engagement system offline. And so we need to help patients bring that system back online. Here's how you can do that.
The therapist has to realize the power of their presence. And this is how we get that social engagement system back on board. Within the world of mental health treatment models, people are taught skill sets. The skill sets tend to be manualized. Manualization is not the same thing as being present. So we start seeing that who are the super therapists? The super therapists, regardless of what their training is, are the people who can be present. And what is their special skill? Their special skill is that they can witness the other person. When we say witness, what we're saying, they're being present. So we have this tremendous value in understanding that it's not words, it's not sequences of words, it's not two people pulling a rope or playing with a stuffed doll or throwing a ball back and forth. It's the sense that you are here. You are here for me. And how is that being conveyed? It's not being conveyed is that you are here for me for 48 minutes and then you have to run and do something else. But you are here for me.
I want you to let that sink in for a minute because that deep presence can often unlock your patient's ability to socially engage. Not only that,
but you need to have that intervening capacity of self-observation. Of course, the therapist can, for a time being, play that role of being an external observer sometimes, but the real role of the therapist is to activate that internal self-observation.
Now, in addition to fostering your patient's ability to socially engage and increasing their capacity for self-observation, the therapeutic relationship also needs to nurture or help to repair your patient's capability to trust. So, how can we begin to bring their trust online? According to Dr. Ruth Lanius, you can do that through the practice of rupture and repair.
Often the therapeutic relationship is a great model for that, where you can teach somebody that, if there's a rupture, if there's tension in the relationship, that you can heal such rupture and repair such rupture, which then can be taken into other relationships. And the client needs to be empowered to express, when they feel hurt by the therapist, when they feel rejected by the therapist, and to bring this up. And then the therapist can say, I'm so glad you brought this up. I'm not meaning to reject you. I was just, for example, pointing out that the way you're behaving may result in tension.
Ruth makes an important point about empowering patients to express their feelings toward us, especially when there's conflict or they're feeling rejected. But I want to bring up an important caveat. We need to be prepared for not liking what the patient may have to say. Not only that, it's essential to be aware that your patient may think that what happened to them at the time of their trauma may happen to them again in therapy. That's an important lesson Ruth learned with one of her patients.
I will never forget being in my office with a woman who had been repeatedly sexually traumatized by her mother and also raped in adulthood. And I explored how she felt about being in my office and in relationship with me. And she disclosed to me that she actually expected me to rape her. And, this was really eye opening for me. And I've really taken this to all my other cases. And now, when I start seeing someone, I really explore how individuals coming into therapy feel about being in therapy, feel about being in my office, and how they feel about being in relationship with me.
It can often be dysregulating for practitioners when we realize that a patient may view us in the same way they view their perpetrator. But that's the nature of trauma. Even though the experience of it may be in the past, it can shape how your patient interprets safety or threat in the present. Now, a little while ago, we talked about why intimate relationships can be especially triggering for a person who's experienced trauma. So we want to get into some strategies that we can use with couples when trauma lies at the heart of their relationship dynamics. To do that, I want to revisit some of the parts work that we talked about earlier. So first, we have to lay some groundwork. You see, we need to help patients recognize that an inner wounded child exists within both of them.
I have a kind of story, I say. Once upon a time, you two people met each other, and your wise adult mind said, "Oh, with this person, I have a chance to build a different kind of life than the life I experienced in my family." And so these two wise, loving adults come together with this wish to create something good. But what they don't know is they each bring their child selves. I always have a child size easel in my office on which I can draw diagrams. So I usually turn to my easel and I put a little rectangle for each member of the couple, two lines and two circles under each adult rectangle. And I say, each of you unknowingly brought into this relationship your young child self and your teenage protector. Somebody does something that triggers a wounded child, which triggers some type of defensive response from the teenage protector, which triggers the other person's child self, and on and on and on it goes.
What you've just heard from Dr. Janina Fisher echoes what we heard earlier from Terry Reel and Dr. Richard Schwartz. Although she's using different terminology, they're all describing the same core concept, that the parts we develop to manage past trauma can end up running our relationships. Now, in addition, the trauma itself can also cause patients to misread or misunderstand cues from their partners. They've learned to take what they're seeing and filter it through their trauma experience. So, how do you help your patients realize just how off base they might be in interpreting their partner's actions? For Dr. Pat Ogden, it's about helping couples uncover the implicit meaning in their body to body communication. And remember, implicit memory isn't experienced consciously by the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that helps us give an account of what happened, but rather implicit memory is felt.
I'm thinking of one couple, he was pulling up like this. He was defending against the impact of her dissatisfaction with him. For her, that meant that she wasn't lovable, he didn't want her. he was going to leave her. It had a totally different meaning that wasn't accurate. And so I said to her, I said, okay, look at his body and that tension. And if his body could talk, what would it say to you? And she said, he's leaving. He doesn't think I'm lovable. He's going to leave me. And he was like, what? So that was the meaning of her, that her implicit self made. So it's a wonderful thing to translate that body to body communication with a couple and reveal the meanings that they're making, because they're almost always not accurate. And that alone is a breakthrough for the couple.
Now, another way you might help couples become aware that an implicit memory is driving conflict in their relationship is to use mindfulness.
So if they're talking about fighting all the time, I might say, well, how about we remember your last fight? And then comes mindfulness. Then I'll direct the client into be aware of what happens right now as you remember, because as you remember, you're reliving it to some degree. So that will start to bring forward those implicit patterns. So we can start to identify them, and instead of becoming more activated and more angry or upset by talking about the problem, we trade that for curiosity. They become really interested in how they're responding, and they start to learn things that they never learned before. Like, oh, I didn't know I stopped breathing. Oh, I can feel myself leaning forward and my shoulders are getting tense. And this curiosity is a great asset, because through the curiosity, they can learn something new. So the important part in sensory motor psychotherapy approach is discovering that organization of experience. So the stimulus that you decide on is explored in an experimental fashion. And it's as if you're slowing down time, because that mindful state of curiosity and exploration is much slower than talking about something.
Now, I want to share just one more strategy that can help your patient when a past trauma is causing dysregulation in their current relationship. It's about helping patients learn to speak for their wounded inner part and not from that part.
So, for example, the difference between speaking for an angry part and speaking from an angry part would be, the angry part would say, screw you, I hate you, you're blah blah blah, whatever, you're not listening to me. And the speaking for that part would be, I have a part who feels like you're not listening. It's really pissed right now. Let me check with it. I'm going to tell you what it's saying. It's saying it never gets heard by anybody. You haven't listened for years, whatever. So, and then the other person can go, okay, I can hear that, right? But they can't hear it when they're being yelled at.
So when we're able to help patients separate from their parts, it can radically shift the way that they interact with one another. But it's a multi-step process. Patients must first learn how to notice their parts and begin to tune into their own reactivity. Then they need to learn to separate from their parts, to speak for them, not to speak from them. And finally, they need to practice listening from a place of compassion rather than from a part. Now, up next, we're going to get into why patients reenact trauma from past relationships and how to help them stop the cycle. But real quick, if you missed any of the sessions in this program, or if you'd like to hear them again, just click on the order button right below. With the gold package, you'll get the video and audio recordings plus full transcripts of all 5 sessions in the program. The gold package includes the suite of learning tools and several special bonuses to give you more strategies for tuning into the ideas from the program, turning them into action with your patients. But here's the thing. The price of the program will be going up at midnight next Tuesday, November 17th. So be sure to buy it now to get in on the discounted price. So now let's look at how old patterns left over from childhood can be reenacted in your patient's current relationships.
Well, this the nature of the beast is to repeat our relationships with each other. And we get certain patterns of behavior that we acquire through experience over time. And these patterns become fixed action patterns. So it is sort of a core structural issue of mind brain, how we have predetermined fixed action patterns of engaging with the world.
Reenactment behaviors are made up of complex layers. Not only are they heartbreaking to watch, but because these patterns developed over time and have become fixed, they can be extremely hard patterns for patients to break.
I think it's so important to remember that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go reenact some trauma today. Right? Right? It's unconscious forces at work, and it's procedural learning. It's the muscle memory of early experience. You see what appears to be choice, right? And we say, why does this individual keep choosing abusive men? It's not a choice. I always say the most intense biological drives we have are first for proximity or attachment seeking, and the second or equally strong drives are fight and flight. And so disorganized or traumatic attachment causes these alternating intense drives. Unfortunately, the nice, kind, safe partner evokes fight and flight. The abusive partner evokes the proximity seeking instinct because we're all biologically wired to seek our attachment figures at times of stress.
Now, it's one thing to understand what drives reenactment behaviors, but as always, our goal is to help patients learn how to disrupt these patterns and to develop new ways of relating to others. And one of the strategies for doing this is to help patients reframe their reenactment behaviors as a strength.
I had a patient who was prostituted as a child, and she compulsively reenacted sexual behavior, often without awareness. She would just go out and prostitute herself over and over again, and she hated herself for it. She was disgusted with herself for it. She wasn't able to bring it up in therapy for a long period of time for fear that I will leave her because I will feel that she's a really disgusting person who I don't want to treat. And so I said, I'm so glad you bring this up. Let's look at how, engaging in sexual behavior actually helped you to survive in the past. And we looked at, the fact that if she hadn't engaged in prostitution as a child, she would have been really hurt by her caregivers because that's what they wanted her to do. And so I said, so this part of you that engaged in sexual activity as a child really protected you to survive. And let's look at the strength of that part of you, right? What is that part able to do? And, this was critical to your survival. And we came to a discussion where we both agreed that this part can really do anything. Right? If this part got her through prostitution as a child, this part can do anything. And I said, that's a great strength. And I think you can be very proud of that part because that part helped you to survive. And so being able to do anything, how can we use that in the present to help you to heal in therapy? Because therapy is hard. There's many challenges. So how can we help you to use that strength?
So, reenactment behaviors and patterns of repeated abusive relationships are automatic. Patients are not making these decisions at a conscious level. And just as Ruth helped her patient to see these behaviors aid survival, that's why they keep being repeated. But at some point, patients who have escaped the original trauma no longer need to survive in this way. Instead, they need to see the destructive impact these patterns are having. So, how can we help patients develop this awareness?
Usually, after another round of these very rejecting or abusive relationships, the client says, is there something wrong with me that I keep choosing these men? And that's my entry point because I can say, yes, there is a pattern. You don't choose them, your body chooses them. And then I say, it's all about triggering. Think about what you feel around the nice guys. And usually, with most of my clients, there's been a nice guy who got rejected or got relegated to the status of friend. So I could say, think about Patrick. And as soon as he wanted a relationship, what got triggered in you? And they'll say, ugh, like I'm not attracted to him. And then I say, okay. And then Jim came along, and what got triggered with Jim? And so I explain it as an issue of triggering. When I say this is traumatic attachment, it's not your fault. It's all in our biology. That if we don't feel safe, we're wired to want more closeness, not less. When we feel safe, all of our radar systems turn on because we don't trust safe. I find trauma treatment to be an exercise in repeating myself over and over and over again because, of course, these are new ideas. The old patterns are so automatic, so unconscious. So often it takes a lot of repetition before the client starts to notice these patterns and head them off at the pass.
So, by now, we've shared a strategy for helping patients understand the implicit memories that fuel conflict in their relationships. And we've looked at how trauma can cause patients to reenact past relationships and how to help them break the cycle. So, next, I want to look at how each of the trauma responses that we've covered over the last 4 weeks can affect your patient's relationships. To start, let's look at how we might help a patient whose relationships are suffering because they freeze in the face of threat or conflict.
We really have to educate both parties about the freeze response, how that helped the individual to survive at the time of the trauma, and how to recognize it, and to recognize different aspects of it, right? For some people, the whole body freezes, all the muscles freeze, and they actually describe feeling like they're in cement, they can't move any of their muscles. For other people, the arm may freeze, or the foot and leg may freeze. For other people, the gaze freezes. For other people, it's the intercostal muscles that help us, to breathe freeze, and all of a sudden, the person's breathing may become very shallow, and they may start to zone out a little bit.
So, as we've often said throughout this program, a key first step might be psychoeducation. But you want to help both people in the relationship become aware of the freeze response, what it looks like, and how to recognize when it's happening. The next step is to talk about how to help the person who freezes to come out of that response.
And getting the individual that freezes to take some control and to instruct the partner, what would be helpful for you to do when I freeze? So they both feel that they're collaborating in this, I think is absolutely critical. And so, they may instruct the partner, when you notice that I can't move, then I want you to, put some deep pressure on either, my hands or my shoulders until you feel that things are moving again. That's just one example. When we're in a relationship and we understand what's happening, we understand how painful the freezing response is for an individual, how terrifying it is because they can't move, to have that empathy around how difficult this is for their partner.
So, next, let's look at dissociation. As I know you know, dissociation can make it hard for people to be in relationships. It can impact their capacity to connect as a parent or as a spouse. So, where do we begin in helping dissociative patients become more present and more connected with others, especially those they love and care about most?
There are ways to overcome this and to really not just teach the patient, but also the partner on how they can ground the patient and how they can help the individual come into the present so both can be in the relationship. We've talked a lot about grounding strategies, using the five senses to really come into the present and, helping again the patient and the partner to do this. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you feel? And encouraging the partner to start grounding, the individual, when they dissociate, not to be afraid that, this is a normal response. And it's very easy to come back into the present as long as you know what to do. And so really getting both individuals to work together.
Now, it can also be critical to know how to address this within the context of a parent-child relationship, too. That's why we've included a special bonus with the Gold Package to give you strategies for helping families cope when a parent has a dissociative disorder. Now, what about when your patient continually experiences a collapse-submit response? How do we work with that within the context of relationships? Again, it's important to bring in that psychoeducation for both people. What this response is, why it happens, and how it helped one partner to survive. Not only that, but also
how difficult that stance really is, how it leads to chronic feelings of helplessness, a lack of agency, and how that may make the other person in the relationship feel, right? Maybe angry, finally do something, right? They may say to the other person, stop lying around and not do anything, but, help me, engage with me. Or alternatively, I think individuals who are in this collapse submit state, really engage often relationships that are quite abusive because they can't fight back.
So, how do we work with both people to get them more comfortable with engaging more active defenses, being more present, and developing a greater sense of agency? For Ruth, it often comes down to asking a few direct, practical questions.
What would that be like for both of you? Are you worried about bringing those strategies online? You've been used to your partner being like this for such a long time. What would it be like all of a sudden if that were different? And so also, working through those fears, because we're all human and we don't like change. And so even if it's a change for the positive, it may not feel like it for both parties. And so really working through that and then, helping the individual who's collapsed a lot of the time to develop more active defensive strategies, right? To bring that sympathetic nervous system online, to be in the present, to develop a sense of agency, and to feel much less helpless. And, sometimes the relationships will change as a result of that.
Ruth just brought up an important point that changing how our patients function in their relationship may have unintended consequences.
I think what's really important is to inform the individual of that before you do this work. That, sometimes a consequence of doing this work is that some of your relationships will change. And are you okay with that? And then just working very slowly and keep assessing what's this like for the person to engage in these changes. Because I think it's important never to make the assumption that just because we as therapists think, oh, this is great, this person's getting out of collapse, submit. So checking in with our clients, what's that like for you? And what's that like for your relationship? How are things working out?
Now, compared with the different different coping strategies and adaptations we've looked at so far. So that's the freeze response, dissociation, and collapse submit. You might consider this next one to be the most intensely interpersonal. I'm talking about please and appease.
I think of the different strategies, this one, it becomes a characterological stance in relationships very easily. And that people who adapted it as a kid wind up in their adult life kind of doing it with everybody. If we can't express or aren't expressing our true feelings, it's not going to be a genuine relationship. We're never going to really be able to feel close and connected to others because we're not actually telling them what we're actually thinking and feeling. We're just reading them. We're looking for signs or signals that what we're doing is being approved of. The other thing that please and appease does in relationships is problematic is it leads to power imbalances. And we know from the Gottman's research and others that successful relationships that feel fulfilling to both parties are typically relationships in which the power is somehow balanced. If we're drawn toward characterologically toward please and appease, we're going to get stuck in power imbalances.
So once your patient understands the toll that their please and appease response is taking on their relationship, how do you help them start to undo it?
We have to start with why it was helpful to develop it and to help the person to see that they quite naturally developed this posture in the world. It made perfect sense. It was not safe to do anything but please and appease when they were younger. And to consider that their current circumstance may be different. If they've, gotten involved in a relationship with somebody who really likes, wants, and insists that our client please and appease them, then if the client shifts, it's going to destabilize the relationship and they're going to get blowback. But some people are in relationships in which the other person isn't really demanding this. In fact, the other person may be somewhat dissatisfied by the fact that they can't really sense us, they can't really feel us because we're not we're not expressing our true feelings. And if that's what's happening, then starting to speak up a little bit may be helpful.
And finally, just last week, we did a deep dive into how to work with trauma-induced shame. So how might we address the impact of shame on a patient's relationships? For Dr. Kelly Wilson, it's about working with the utter isolation that shame can induce.
It's such an odd thing to connect around isolation. It's kind of counterintuitive to connect around isolation, but entirely possible and genuine and potent, I would say. If I ask people to imagine that someone that they loved who is small encountered a day like that, and they would be able to be someone in that person's world who could see that, could see it and know it and be present for them. Would they carry their own sadness if it helped them, to see the hearts of the people around them? Sometimes it because I think people can intuitively understand that their suffering allows them to see suffering in ways that maybe others don't. And if you start to kind of look around their life and use that as a kind of a lens in their lives, it alters their relationship with their suffering, I think. Sometimes they can feel great compassion for the 8-year-old version of themselves. It's much more difficult to feel towards the 35-year-old version of themselves.
We've covered so much ground in this program, and a lot of it is captured by something Kelly just said. As practitioners, our ultimate goal is to help patients alter their relationship with suffering, because that can change their lives. This is the end of our Advanced Master Program on the treatment of trauma, so thank you again for the work that you do. I hope this program has left you with a wide range of concrete, practical strategies that you'll put to good use with your patients. Your purchase of a gold subscription will help us to continue to create programs such as these. It will also help us to support our mission to make this program available to practitioners around the world without regard for their ability to pay. And once again, the price of this program is going up this Tuesday, You'll still be able to get it after that, but it'll cost more. So do register for it now so that you can get in on the lowest price. Because remember, all the training in the world won't make a difference if you don't apply it in your practice. So please, go right now to the comment board and share how you'll use the ideas from today's session. Let us know your biggest takeaways from what you've just heard. You can find the link below, and be sure to take a look at how other practitioners plan to use these ideas with their patients. It might spark some new ideas for you. And I'll close this program by saying something that I've said in every program. What you do is so important. I believe that when you help someone heal from trauma, you change the course of civilization. That's because it's not just that person's life that changes, but that one person's healing can have an impact on their spouse, on their children, and their friends and their colleagues. And that can ripple out to their community, to their state, and then to their country, and eventually to the world. Thank you for what you do, and thanks for watching.